preserve the story of Michigan in defense of democracy. Today we have Michael W.R. Davis, author of a number of books that he has over here on the table, and I'm sure you have for sale at the end of the lecture. And he did this article on the death of Patton, and that's what he's going to be discussing with us today. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I'm sure my mother probably hit you all up already when you came in, but the quilt that is hanging out in the lobby, we are going to be pulling a ticket for a winner at the end of the lecture today. So if you want a ticket for that, this is your last chance to get one. You can see us after the lecture right before we pull them. So other than that, our lectures are by donation. If you haven't already, there's a donation box just outside the door. All the money goes to people who leave the lights on. So somebody coming in here. So I guess without any further delay, I'm going to introduce Michael Davis.
There's an on-off switch someplace for me. You just turned me on. Well, good Sunday afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hate to say this, but I'm almost sorry to see some of the ladies because that's going to filter my language a little bit. But anyway, several years ago, when my son, who was a naval officer, decided to get out of the service, and he'd just come back from the second tour in Iraq. He was a Navy doctor with a Marine Corps unit. And anyway, he decided to keep treating his guys by going to work for a veterans hospital. And he saw an opening for his specialty in the VA hospital in Louisville, which was my hometown. So he decided he would apply for that slot. And then he had to send for his furniture and whatnot that had been in storage in San Diego, and he had to do it at the nearest military base, which happened to be Fort Knox, Kentucky. It's about 40 miles outside of Louisville. Well, so I happened to be visiting him then when he had to go do all the bureaucratic stuff with the Army. Now, it was kind of amusing because he was a lieutenant commander, which is the same as a major in the Army or the Marine Corps or the Air Force. But anyway, they didn't know what to make of a lieutenant commander there. They didn't know whether he was an admiral or a general or what. And I found that very amusing, but it just tells you how times pass and the younger generation just doesn't remember things like that. And anyway, the Patton Museum is at Fort Knox, or it was then, which was about 7 years ago. And I had to see it. I was curious to see what was there, because I had served in the summer training of the Kentucky National Guard at Fort Knox back in the 40s. And at that time, the Patton Museum was, pretty new and consisted mostly of captured German artillery and trucks and tanks and whatnot that Patton had sort of rounded up in his North African and Sicilian campaigns. So I was curious to see, if it was the same. And I went in there and I discovered in the exhibits in that Patton Museum, there was the car in which he had sustained his fatal injuries. And you'll see this again, but and anyway, I ended up, because I had some knowledge of automotive safety and crashes and so on and so forth, I was, and the placards in the museum about this, it gave me a lot of new information about the crash. And a friend of mine was working as editor of this publication, Automobile Quarterly, and he asked me for some story ideas, and so I said, I think we should do one on Patton's fatal accident. So that's how I came to write the story that I did, research it and write it, and it was published. Unfortunately, it was in the last edition of this quarterly magazine, which has a hardcover like as if it was a book. So it's unlikely, except maybe on eBay, that you'd ever be able to buy one of these. And I did send Chris just hold up your hand if I'm not getting through.
They can't hear you back here.
Well, I'm wearing my ears here, see, so on top, electronically augmented. I apologize. So Chris was going to run off some copies of this in case you want to read the story which I wrote for that magazine. I had some other knowledge of this, the controversy, because my brother-in-law, my sister's husband, had self-published a book in which he maintained that Patton had been murdered, assassinated, if you would. But I couldn't talk him out of it. I thought it was impossible. And in all the research I did, I still think so. You wouldn't know it from this book, which Bill O'Reilly's Killing Patton, which was until recently the #1 nonfiction bestseller in the New York Times list. So I was curious to see, well, what did these guys know that I didn't know? And the answer is they didn't. But I'm sort of getting ahead of myself a little bit. It also happened that I had a friend in a group which I was a member of, Ford retirees, and I ran into this guy filling the gas tank of his 1942 Ford Army staff car at a gas station near where I lived. Art Pope here, and Art, I'd soon discovered, had made a pastime of portraying Patton at various veterans gatherings and so on over the years. He retired from that recently, but I'll tell you, he really looks the part, particularly when he's done up with jodhpurs and riding boots and a pearl-handled revolver and so on, and a helmet with the 4 stars on it. Having said all that, and I looked at this, and and of course I fly-specced it to find errors against the stuff that I knew. So I just, this I borrowed from the Royal Oak Public Library, but because I didn't want to send any money, any extra money in royalties to O'Reilly. So let me get on with my PowerPoint presentation here. Oh, and by the way, I did give this a couple of years ago at the Grosse Pointe Veterans Club. So if any of you happen to be members of that and attended that, well, I hope this won't be a disappointment because you've seen it before. Okay, just a little bit about Patton's life. He was the most colorful and undoubtedly the most quoted general from any army during World War II. He was from a distinguished Southern family. His grandfather was a Confederate officer killed in an 1863 battle in Virginia, which was where the family was from. He was born and grew up on his family's ranch in Southern California before it got filled with orange groves and subdivisions and so on. Unlike some other World War II distinguished generals, he was not at the head of his class. And in fact, in any event, he entered Virginia Military Institute in 1903 at the age of 18, which is about the right point in time. Eventually, Patton switched from VMI, which was where General Marshall had graduated from, to West Point, and graduated age 24 in 1909, which, you know, you do the math and you figure out he didn't do it in 4 years like you're supposed to, for whether he dropped out of VMI or flunked out. That isn't the kind of stuff that you'll read in all of his biographies. But he was commissioned as a cavalry officer, hence his familiar get-ups in many pictures, as you'll see, of wearing riding jodhpurs, which are, you know, kind of full, and polished boots, riding boots. And indeed, he was having grown up on a ranch, he was such a good rider that he was in the U.S. team at the 1912 Olympics in the pentathlon, which involves several different kinds of ability in different kinds of sports. And as a young second lieutenant and a cavalry officer, he served on Blackjack Pershing's staff in the Mexican border incidents in 1915 or so. However, rather than riding horses, he pursued Pancho Villa in Dodge touring cars, which was what, you know, they were new then, and they were quite reliable and more powerful and so on than Model Ts, for example. Anyway, he was promoted to first lieutenant about right. He was 6 years out of West Point, and he got promoted to first lieutenant. In the years between wars, that's very common to have to wait that long to get a promotion. World War I, U.S. gets into the war, and again he followed Pershing as a member of his staff to France. Pershing, in the First World War, you'll remember, was the head of American forces in France. And he attended the French tank school, and thus becoming the pioneer U.S. Army tanker. And those were very primitive vehicles, let me tell you. They do have one at the right in the front of the museum at Fort Knox, but that's what you can see it there. It was a Renault tank, and it was one of the elements, the technological developments that took place in the First World War, which were developed in the face of the slaughter in the trench warfare. And he actually led tanks in battles, was wounded, awarded the Distinguished Service Medal and the Distinguished Service Cross, and promoted to temporary colonel, which is, you know, he waited 6 years to get from second lieutenant to first lieutenant, and then all of a sudden he jumps up to bird colonel. And here's a picture of him with the bird on his overseas cap. But it's typical, particularly after World War I, then they all reverted to lower ranks after the war. So he went back to being a captain. He didn't get advance again. 1934, he made lieutenant colonel, and as such, he developed the U.S. Army's tank corps doctrine. You know, how do you fight a war with tanks? Well, no one really knew very much about that at the time. It was very important. As it turned out, anything that they developed then probably was thrown out the window, and rightfully so, after the German blitzkriegs in Europe in 1940. 38, he made colonel, and in 40, a brigadier general, 1 star, and commander of the 3rd Armored Brigade. He participated in the Desert Training Center in California as a major general, and also, interestingly enough, obtained a pilot's license. Kind of unusual for a tanker. But again, he had the foresight to see that this was something that an officer who wants to get ahead needed to do, and indeed he used that knowledge very successfully later in World War II in the 3rd Armored race across France, and in relieving the troops who were surrounded at Bastogne in Belgium in the big German push. The first real turnaround battle or campaign in Europe, or what constituted Europe and North Africa, was in the fall of '42 when the U.S. invaded North Africa, the former French colonies there. And unfortunately, they had to fight the French as well as later on the Germans. But his North African campaign, after a disastrous loss of Americans at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia, he was able to inspire his troops and perhaps some of his knowledge of tactics and so on to defeat the Germans and drive them out of Tunisia and so on. Then he participated in the planning for the Sicily invasion. Sicily was a big island sort of between the Italian boot and North Africa. And he led an American group in the invasion of Sicily, and significantly, he was able to reach Messina, which was the target city, the closest one to the Italian boot, northeastern part of the island of Sicily. He got there before Great Britain's Montgomery, who had proclaimed that he was going to rescue Sicily, but Patton got there first. So, he was a great hero to Americans. British didn't care much for him. And then he had the unfortunate experience of finding some soldiers in a military hospital after the battles there that he felt were lollygagging, for lack of a better word. And he actually slapped them and told them, get back to your units and fight like men. And somebody leaked this to a Washington columnist of the day, Drew Pearson. And that started a long chain of unfortunate incidents in the life of Patton, aside from his great battle victories. But the press were on his case and looking for things to criticize and so forth. Some things never changed. And indeed, Eisenhower had to pull him out of the limelight. Eisenhower was the commander of both the combined British and American forces, you may recall. Anyway, as they were planning for the invasion of France, they parked Patton off in a corner of England where he really had no forces at his disposal, as a way of tricking the Germans, and they succeeded by parking Patton off to the side, and of course George typically popped off to the press on things he shouldn't say in good public relations, and this just got more attention to him to fool the Nazis, who were thinking that the invasion would take place opposite where Patton had his phony army, and in eastern England, whereas, as you know, the actual invasion took place from southwestern England to the Normandy coast. Well, so that was successful. And then, of course, he was going nuts. He was a fighter. He didn't like being a dummy in charge of a dummy army. And fortunately for everybody but the Germans, the British, the French, the Americans, they put him in charge of the Third Army, and it succeeded in racing across France and capturing tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Germans, and so forth. He was always known for leading from the front. It's a new expression. This is a picture from Sicily, and unfortunately the computer formatting chops off part of his face, but you know who he is and what he looks like, except that most Americans think he looks like the movie actor who played him in the movie Patton. And there's some resemblance, actually. But our friend Art Pope here actually looks more like Patton. Yeah, did you know that George was actually from Bloomfield Hills originally? A lot of people don't know that. The guy who plays Patton. Who's George Scott. I'm sorry. Hell, I'm 84 years old. I can't remember names sometimes. Sorry, folks.
He went to Dearborn High.
Did he? Okay.
No, Dearborn. I know classmates.
And actually, they were portrayed by the press as being arch enemies. And here's a picture, again, with the upper parts of the face cut off by my computer, because I'm not that adept at... Yeah, that's Monty, who were portrayed by the press as their, enemies and so on, because Patton had beat Monty to Messina. But it does show you, here's his typical riding jodhpurs that Patton is wearing. He's got a riding crop in his hand, and you can just see the tops of his riding boots at the bottom. So after the breakout at Saint-Lô, he raced across France to the Vosges Mountains, which are just short of the Rhine River on the French side. And he was credited by doing the same thing that the Nazis did in their Blitzkrieg attack in 1940, in their coordinating air, armor, and artillery, heavy reliance on communications, and good intelligence. And when the call came that we had to relieve the guys who were trapped at Bastogne.
It was not overnight, it was several days. In fact, maybe a week or two.
Yeah, well, that's right. Yeah, indeed. But I think it's probably true. Nobody thought he could do it, because he's way down near the Swiss border with his Third Army, and he had to get all the way across to northern France and the northeast area, very much the northeast, in order to relieve Bastogne. But he did. And he, as a consequence of that, he was promoted to a 4-star general. After the Germans finally gave up in May of '45, he was appointed the military governor of Bavaria, which is southern Germany. And once again, he gets quoted in the news media saying things that weren't good public relations. He was just speaking his mind, which is most of the time we admire somebody like that. But he got bad press, and Eisenhower, under pressure from his bosses in Washington relieved George Patton and put him in charge of the 15th Army with the assignment to do a history of the war from the U.S. Army's point of view, which, you know, probably he was very well suited to do that, except he didn't think so. You know, he wanted to continue to be a battle general. Nevertheless, and I don't know if any of you are old enough to have actually been part of this. In 1945, we had hundreds of thousands of troops overseas, and there was a great rush to get them back to the States. They had an elaborate system of points. You had to have so many points, and then you could return to the States and get discharged and get back.
Actually, it was quite simple.
If you flew enough missions, if you were in the Air Force, yeah. Yeah, you got so many points for each mission in the Air Force.
62.
Wow, that's a lot.
Got me home in January.
Well, you know, and I had cousins who were over there, and one was a 18-year-old sergeant in the Battle of the Bulge, mortar squad sergeant, and the other cousin was a B-17 pilot, 15th Air Force, out of Italy. And they got back. The pilot got back first. He had the points. He got back in December of 45. So in any event, for whatever reason, Patton was scheduled to leave Germany and return to the United States, and then presumably to get out of the Army. He was scheduled to leave on Monday, December 10th. Well, that is part of the source of some of the rumors and beliefs about his being assassinated. The theory being that this was the last chance they had to get him, whoever the they were. If they didn't get him on that Sunday, the 9th of December, you know, they couldn't get him. They couldn't get at him. Any event, he was then stationed up here at Bad Nauheim, or Bad Nauheim. I don't know. Bath means bath. Germany, that part of Germany is full of hot springs and so on. So a lot of bad means bath in German. So he was up here, and on that Sunday morning, he summoned up his Cadillac limousine, and with the idea of going down, way down here, to go bird hunting. However, he also wanted to look at some Roman ruins from the 1st century or so, which were in a town over here that doesn't show on this map, as I recall. This map, by the way, it's a 1960 road map of Europe that I saved from the first trip I made to Europe, which was in 1960. And as such, a lot of it had been rebuilt since the end of the war in 1945. For example, the purple roads, those are the Autobahns. And most in particular, I remember that the bridges were down wherever there was a river. The Germans had destroyed the bridges to prevent the Americans from advancing. And as you know, there was the famous railroad bridge at Remagen and so on, which they didn't succeed, and we got across and so on. Anyway, so he starts out from here on a Sunday morning to go bird hunting in his 1938 Cadillac limousine. And there's another story about that too. And accompanied by his longtime chief of staff, a major general named Hobart Gay. So just the two of them in the back of the limousine. And they came down here and to look at these Roman ruins someplace. And then they got on, came on down, as near as I can tell, following this Road 3, which is sort of like a U.S. highway, not up to being like a superhighway like the Autobahns or like I-75 or whatever. They came down here and turned off on a side road which runs through here. Doesn't show. The side roads are the yellow ones. And at just about the point where that arrow is, which marks the center of town, they crossed a railroad, and you can see the railroad line on the black line coming down here. They crossed a railroad. They had to stop for a train that was coming across. Went a little bit further, and according to the official report, and there, by the way, I didn't find the actual accident report that I was hoping to find, but I found the next best thing, which was the Army's news release written by the Public Information Office from the actual accident report. And there's no great mystery. I just set off to the National Archives in Washington and asked them to send me everything they had on Patton from December 1945, and this was among the take. Now, any of you who've been in the service can imagine that two things. Number one, that where a four-star general was concerned, that news release would have been gone over by everybody up the chain of command before it was ever released. Just like when I was at Ford Motor Company and we produced some sort of a news release, it went up our chain of command as well as all the other people who were involved, the engineers like Art, the lawyers, the finance people, and so on. Well, I'm sure it's a little bit simpler in the Army, except it just goes up the chain of command. And so a Army public information officer wrote this release on the basis of the actual accident report. And the other thing is, now the conspiracy theorists attach a lot of importance to the fact that nobody's been able to find that original accident report, which was filled out by an MP lieutenant. Well, again, anybody who's been in the service knows that two things in this case. One, Americans and practically everybody else like to collect souvenirs. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if that actual original accident report is someplace, some souvenir, or down into the grandchildren now. The other thing is, it is really easy to lose one piece of paper. It's not a conspiracy, it's just how things get lost. You know, you can, a single piece of paper. Well, so what happened, this is a little bit closer up picture. They were on this road here, going down to take one or the other of the yellow ones. Right here, you can see where the black line is the railroad, where it crosses, and that's approximately where the collision happened. Oh, by the way, this is just a fast look at the what the museum is like today. We're going to look at the collision in a moment.
Oh, I'm changing your story now.
No. I'm just dragging this out to give you your money's worth. Okay, so there's the Cadillac, the 1938 Cadillac Model 75, and the minute I saw it, I knew there was something wrong. Now there's if you see, there is a portrait painting of Patton, and but the minute I saw this car, I knew there was something wrong, because I knew it was supposed to be a 1938 model Cadillac. I'm something of a car buff. I mean, that's... Now,
That's not the real one? That's not the real car?
oh, it is. It is. Therein lies more mystery.
There's something wrong with the car, okay.
Well, there is. You'll see it in a moment. I think I've got that slide in here. Anyway, beside the car in that painting of Patton, there was a big label all about this MP lieutenant and what he had to say, and had information I'd never heard of before. But that statement says that this guy, Lieutenant Balabas, was with another Army MP lieutenant in a confiscated Mercedes traveling along the highway and the same direction as Patton's car. And it was passed by this limousine with the 4 stars on it, Zippo, and then they come up to the railroad crossing and they have to stop because there's a train coming. And these two, and in that placard at the museum, it says that they arrived on the scene of the crash almost instantly. And see, in his words, before the dust had settled. And if you've ever seen a crash, you know, that's what happens. There's lots of accumulated dust and dirt and one thing and another, specks of things, and a crash happens and there's a big blossom of dust and debris. Lieutenant Babalas, however you pronounce his name, took charge of the investigation, and the other lieutenant cleared the crash scene, because it's potentially a busy highway, a connector link. And he could, Lieutenant Babalas could see that only Patton was injured, and he was bleeding from a cut on his scalp. And indeed, this placard goes on to say he wanted to charge the 2 drivers with negligence, the truck driver with failing to yield right of way, and the limo driver with excessive speed, because they'd observed the limo go zip past them. Now, since I brought up the truck driver here, what happened in the actual crash was this. The Cadillac is starting up after having stopped at the railroad crossing, and there's an Army 6x6 2.5 ton truck, and it is approaching them, and it makes a left turn right in the right across the path of the Cadillac. And the driver, our friend PFC Woodring, slams on the brakes of the Cadillac. This is the normal thing. We'd all do it. Now, when you do that with a car, slam on the brakes, you ever notice what happens? The front end goes down. It's called nose diving.
Yeah.
It goes down, which actually causes greater damage than you might think otherwise from a fairly low-speed crash. And I hadn't seen this anyplace else. Everything else I'd read about this and afterwards said that nobody was allowed to visit Patton in the hospital. And but Babalas said, or told somebody, that he did visit him and told Patton that he was going to charge the 2 drivers. And by his statement, Patton said, "No, it was just an accident. Don't find either one of these guys at fault. They were just doing their jobs." A little bit more about the character of Patton. Now, when I saw the front of this Cadillac there on exhibit, I knew right away it wasn't a 38, it was a 39. And the 39 front end is there on the right. So you can see there's a big difference in the front ends of these 2 cars. Now, as it happens, there were several different appearances of the front end of 1938 Cadillacs, and that was a lot of my article in this car magazine were about the Cadillac model 75 1938 model year, to sort of differentiate all this. But it's a key thing. But when I saw that, I said, there's something wrong here. But this will be easy to sort out, because the GM Heritage Center has kept track of every Cadillac ever built by its serial number, and which is the same as the engine number. The serial number is mounted on one of the horns of the frame, back in when all cars were body and frame. So I thought this will be easy to sort out where this car came from, because presumably, and so the first I went to, everybody knows, again, in the Army, everything's just like Ford Motor Company, everything's got a brass tag on it, so to speak. It's numbered. They don't just exist out there. They all have their government ID, just like our ASNs. And so I asked the curator at the Fort Knox Patton Museum, what's the serial number of this car? Because I thought I'd go back to GM and find out where this car had been delivered in France. Well, I found out two things that were interesting, but not really didn't answer my basic question. The first thing was that the Cadillac had been captured by the U.S. Army from the German Wehrmacht in August of '44. But the presumption is, and then I went to see, I thought, well, maybe this was, the Germans confiscated it from some family or company in France or Belgium in 1940 after they'd swept across Western Europe. Well, I've learned that there was an organization in Paris which was trying to track down property confiscated from Jewish families by the Germans, by the Nazis. And I thought, well, maybe this would be among the missing valuable pieces of art or what have you, this 38 Cadillac limousine. They didn't have anything on it either. And then I said, well, what about the serial number then? Oh, it's not on the frame because the frame was repaired, and in repairing the frame, they removed the serial number. Okay, how about the engine number, which should be the same as the serial number? And the answer came back, well, that wouldn't do any good because the engine in this car, when it had its crash, came out of an M10 tank. Now, Cadillac built the M10 tanks along with some others, and they all had a Cadillac V8 flathead engine. And so when the Army wanted to put this car back in service before Patton, somewhere or other they removed the engine from a tank, maybe a smashed up tank, and put it in the Cadillac. So the serial number wouldn't have meant anything. I was still trying to track this thing down. Where was it built and so forth, because it was for a car magazine. And it was very frustrating. And then I thought, well, okay, you'd think you could connect those dots, but wasn't ever able to do it. I could only do it by process of elimination, I thought. Well, I found out that not very many of these cars were built in the first place, these 1938 Cadillac limousines of this certain model. And of them, not many were built in the first place. Not many got shipped to Europe before the war. So I wasn't able to identify it. Cadillac had quite a sales operation in Europe before World War II.
You had to have money though.
Well, yeah, somebody had money to buy them, but it could have been a business, a bank, who knows what it might have been. They were quite popular, as a matter of fact, Cadillacs.
So that's not the car, or you don't know?
Well, we don't know, but the assumption is that the Nazis took it away from some owner, whether it was a company or an individual, and then the Americans took it away from the Germans. So in my story, I noted that Patton never realized he was being driven around in a stolen car. Because again, I don't think the presumably American Army unit that captured it from the Germans didn't give a receipt.
The government has no record of automobiles they purchased?
No, they just, you know, it was stolen. Just like these MPs in their Mercedes and my brother-in-law and his Horace or whatever it was. It was very common, and to the victors belong the spoils, right? Anyway, so this is repetitive of what I've already told you. This was the first picture I looked at that I got from the archives at Fort Knox, the museum archives. And the first thing I noticed was that the bumper's totally intact, and in fact, the left-hand bumper guard is intact, which confirmed to me that the driver had slammed on the brakes, the car nosedived, and then it slid underneath this, the side of this 6x6.
The bumpers wouldn't match that standing still.
Right, well, and I'll show you a picture of that right side of the 6x in a moment. But you can see that look at a nose job here, and on this side, on the right side of the car, it was the fender was bent up and so on. And these were pretty heavy-duty fenders on pre-war American cars too. But there's no damage, you know, no body damage really, just the hood and.
Looks like it was hit on the other side though.
Yeah, well.
Passenger side.
Well, this tells you something too. Yeah, and in fact, when you look at the other, now this is what it now when this truck, not this particular one, but this is a fairly typical right-hand view of a 6x, a GMC 6x. The earlier version, there was a later version which was more squared off cab and so on. But this was what it would have hit. In other words, he nosedives and slides into this because this truck had turned right in its path. So it tells you that it came in at a slight angle. Maybe Woody was trying to steer it to the left away from the point of impact, but it crashed right here. And look how thick and heavy that's the step up into the cab. That can do serious damage because any of you again had any experience with these vehicles, they're really heavily built.
So Patton probably got hit in the head inside the car instead of.
Oh yeah, now we're getting to the other part of it. What actually happened to him? Here's Art tells me that this is Woodring here. Let me go back a minute. That's Woodring there, although I don't know, because it looked to me like he was wearing what, in my memory at least, is an officer's overseas cap. But in any event, you can see that the right-hand side of the front of the car is all crumped up, which tells me that that car was at a slight angle, so that the right side, as one of you noted, was all banged up, but the left side wasn't. Now, this is the rear compartment from an advertising brochure of a 1938 Cadillac limousine. Look at the distance. There are two things to look at here. One is the distance from the seat to the divider window mechanism here. And the other, guess what's missing?
Seatbelts.
Seatbelts, right. No seatbelts. No seatbelts. And, you know, knowing what we know about Patton, he probably wouldn't have fastened it anyway, right?
Yeah.
So, and this is what he, when the accident occurred, and I'll read the account, he probably, because he didn't see it coming. Now, General Gay did see it coming and was able to brace himself, still in the seat. Patton didn't see it coming, and so when it slammed on its brakes and so on, he was thrown forward and hit his head probably against this. This is steel, back when steel was steel, and he probably cut his head on the clock here. That's just a guess, you know, on my part, but it makes sense. That's how it comes together. I don't think that Cadillac, or if it did, had a jump seat in it, but if it did, it might just fold into the floor and out of the way. So, in the crash, he was he was injured, but it didn't seem to be a big injury, not a torso injury, anything like that. Let me read from this.
He got a concussion.
No, he broke his neck.
Oh, really?
It was what actually happened. Now this is the official. I'm going to read from the official U.S. Army news release. Again, going back to what I said a few minutes ago, this is the kind of thing that if a sergeant wrote it, it would have been inspected by the master sergeant and by the second lieutenant, the first lieutenant, the captain, the major, lieutenant colonel, the colonel, and maybe even a general if there was one around when everybody was taking off for Christmas holidays. Anyway, it would have been very carefully reviewed. So this is what I got from the National Archives. Unclassified, it says, from Conklin, acting PRO, that's Public Relations Officer, 7th Army, to Information Room, U.S. Forces European Theater, that's the press room where all the newsmen are hanging out. And you got to remember, back in those days, television didn't exist. There was radio, so the copy goes to Armed Forces Radio Network. Some of you may remember that. And this is the text. And I sort of pieced together and it didn't have a date on it, but I think it was probably the Friday after the crash, because the statement says, as General George S. Patton's condition continued to improve today in the 130th Station Hospital at Heidelberg, further details of the accident in which he was seriously injured last Sunday near Nauheim were made available at Headquarters 7th Army Western Military District. The official accident report compiled by members of the 818th Military Police Company on the scene was made public today. And then it proceeds to quote from it. First Lieutenant Peter Babalas, who signed the report as duty officer, recorded his opinion that the accident was caused by carelessness on the part of both drivers. The report showed that General Patton's 1938 Cadillac sedan was being driven south on Highway N38 just north of Nauheim at 11:45 last Sunday morning. Lieutenant Babalas, as the investigating officer, gave his opinion that the general's car was being driven at a speed of approximately 35 miles per hour. Remember, it's starting up from having stopped at the railroad crossing. Private First Class Horace L. Woodring of the Commanding General Section of the 15th Army, commanded by General Patton, was at the wheel. The 23-year-old driver, who comes from Sturgis, Kentucky, by the way, I'm a Kentuckian, if you hadn't noticed it in my accent, was rated as an excellent driver and had a driver's license in his possession. Major General Hobart R. Gray, Chief of Staff of 15th Army, was riding in the back seat with General Patton. As the general's car passed a large quartermaster dump in a section of Nauheim known as Compartment, a 2.5-ton GMC truck driven by T5, and if my memory serves me correctly, that's two. No, well, I thought a T5 was more like a corporal, just two chevrons and a T in the middle.
Oh,
a T5 like a corporal, yeah. By the way, he's identified in the Riley book as technical sergeant, which tells me that both Riley and his co-author are too young to remember what ranks were in WW2. Anyway, driven, and this goes on to say, World War II Army rank similar to corporal. Now that's what I wrote into this. I added that. Robert L. Thompson, 22 years old, of street address omitted, Camden, New Jersey, began a left turn into the quartermaster dump. The cargo truck belonging to the 141st Signal Company of the 1st Armored Division was going 10 miles per hour in the opinion of the investigating officer. That sounds right. It carried Frank Cromer, a civilian employee of the signal company, as a passenger in the body of the truck, meaning the cab of the truck. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute when I get to the O'Reilly book. The truck had almost completed the left turn on the 33-foot wide cobblestone highway when it was struck on the right-hand side by the sedan, which was on its own side of the highway. The accident occurred at 11:45, and both the condition of the road and condition of the two vehicles were listed as excellent in the official report. Have you ever looked at an accident report? I doubt that the ones today are much different than they were, 70 years ago, nearly 71 years ago. The impact damaged the front of the General sedan, including the motor, but did not break any of the glass in the vehicle. The cargo truck had its drive shaft damaged, knocked loose maybe by the impact. Its gasoline tank bent, and you can see that that's behind the cab. And its battery case broken. The truck was first impounded by the military police and later released to its unit 141st Signal Company. Patton's car was taken to MP Motor Pool and later turned over to the 7th Army collecting point. The accident report showed that the truck driver, who had an operator's license in his possession and was rated as an excellent driver, had signaled a left turn as he approached the quartermaster dump, and that Patton's driver had no need to signal anything since he was proceeding straight south. The report entry on the condition of the drivers was, quote, sober, unquote. Major General Gay's account of the accident follows in full, quote, on Sunday, December 9th, 1945, General Patton and I were proceeding south on the Frankfurt-Mannheim Road in a Cadillac driven by Private First Class Horace L. Woodring. We were followed by a 1/4 ton truck, a Jeep, driven by Sergeant Spruce. At approximately 11:45, we slowed down very appreciably to 10 miles an hour to cross the railroad tracks that are on the northern outskirts of Mannheim. Shortly after we crossed the railroad tracks, when again we slowed down, or perhaps we had not picked up speed. Sergeant Spruce in the 1/4 ton truck passed us and motioned for us to follow him, as he knew the route from there and we did not. Approximately at this time, General Patton said, "Look at all the derelict vehicles which were in parks along both the right and left sides of the road." He further remarked, "How awful war is. Think of the waste." Almost immediately, while I was looking to the left, he said, "Look at that." I looked up just in time to see a 2.5 ton truck turning at a 90-degree angle across the road in front of us. I had time to say, "Sit tight," and then we crashed. General Patton was apparently thrown forward and then backward because he fell in my arms with his head to the left, my right arm around his shoulders. I was at that time facing approximately half to the right. He was bleeding profusely from wounds of the scalp and forehead. Signed, Major General Hobart R. Gay, U.S. Army. That's as close to an official report as existed, or at least that has ever been found by anybody. And very shortly, of course, after Patton died, and you have to put this in the context of you've got a whole lot of war correspondents who don't have a war to report on anymore. They're sitting around eager to get back to the States and real jobs and so on. So they're desperate for any kind of news, and including made-up stuff. Having been a journalist, I fully understand this. So they really hopped on this story in a big way, and they tried to, when Patton was in the hospital, the press tried all kinds of subterfuges to interview members of the hospital staff, to sneak into his room and interview him, all kinds of stuff. None of them were successful, as far as anybody knows. Although there were some that claimed they did, but there's no supporting documentation of that. Anyway, my take on it is that this was a minor crash. number one. You can tell that from looking at the side of the car which didn't run into the side of the truck. Number one, a minor impact. Now, when I was at Ford and had responsibility for dealing with the media on our crash tests, I got fairly familiar with what kind of damage you get from a staged 5 mile an hour, 10 mile an hour, 20 mile an hour, and so on crash. And I could see that this was a fairly low speed impact. Second, if you were going to assassinate somebody by running into them, even with a truck, how could you know that it might be successful? I mean, it's just, you couldn't possibly do that. I mean, shooting them is one thing, but there's no way to know that somebody is not going to be fatally injured in a staged crash. Every crash is different,
Yeah, it's kind of hard to see.
etc. And you know, Newton's laws of motion tell you a body once in motion continues in motion, and so on. And that's what happened to Patton. He was a body in motion, and he went forward and hit that divider window.
It's called the second collision.
Yeah, exactly, the second collision. And then as I say, my brother-in-law, who'd been in the counterintelligence corps in Germany in this time period, he became convinced, because as a Ukrainian, he hated the Russians, he hated the communists, and he had a Ukrainian displaced person tell him that the Russians were going to assassinate Patton, because the Russians thought that Patton was a lot more important than he really was, and that he would therefore be, driving on to Moscow, and so on. So whether this was a legitimate fear or not, but this was the theory that they were afraid. Then there was another theory that there were Nazis hiding out in caves or salt mines or something down in Bavaria, and they were for sure going to kill Patton for doing what he did to everything they put through against him. And yet another conspiracy theory was that the British had staged this because they were sore about how Patton treated Monty, John Montgomery. And fourth, there was yet another conspiracy theory, was that political figures back in the States were afraid that Patton would run for president, and so they wanted to get him out of the picture. So all of these conspiracy theories, but I maintain that yeah, right. You couldn't know. I mean, because as I explained, pointing on the map, nobody knew where he was going to be when. You know, they were just out, a couple of guys going for an afternoon bird hunting, and they didn't even go the direct route or anything like that. They weren't on what was left of the autobahns, but on the side roads and so on. There's no way that anybody could have said they will get to point A at X time and we're going to be laying for them.
Yeah, I know, yeah, that'd be hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, so there are two things in my approach to this that say it wasn't murder, it was just an accident, which was what Patton himself said. Now, there are other reasons why these conspiracy theories keep going, aside from the fact that no one has ever found the original report. It turns out that Lieutenant Bavalas, who wrote the report, was not a professional police officer or a professional military policeman even. Again, at the end of hostilities, particularly in Europe, they had a hell of a lot more officers. We had a hell of a lot more officers than there were positions for them to fill, and so they assigned these two guys who had no military police experience to, and then they just, by circumstances, came upon the accident and did what they were, what they were supposed to do. Lieutenant Bavalas, as a matter of fact, had just graduated from Harvard, 44 or 45, it is unclear, and his original training, perhaps in ROTC or something, was in the infantry, and then he was later assigned to field artillery, and from field artillery to military police. You can draw your own conclusions from that. He wasn't a cop. He didn't know how to do a proper accident investigation, it could be argued. And then there was the business of the driver of the 6x6 that cut in front of the Cadillac sort of disappeared. And I've never really seen any documentation of this. He just disappeared. You know, he wasn't around. So when all of the reporters went looking for another victim, he was not to be found.
Oh.
Again, you'd expect this. Here was a guy who purportedly caused the death of our greatest hero, so you'd better believe they buried him someplace, and I don't mean below the ground.
He could have been just transferred to another unit,
Oh.
because we were all moving around depending on your points.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Mixed up.
Yeah, exactly. And so the fact that he started to disappear doesn't really carry any weight with me, because I know what it was like then. I wasn't there, but I was a teenager back home waiting for my cousins and my brother-in-law to come back from overseas and hopefully bring me some neat souvenirs, which they did. In O'Reilly's book, which has got so much notice up until now, his latest book is on killing Reagan. And
He has ghostwriters, he don't write these books, you don't have time to write.
well, I made some notes about the errors I saw in his in the book. Now the way this works is I got to hand it to O'Reilly for enriching his co-author, because with his name on it and given his following on Fox News and everything, anything that has his name on it as an author is going to be a big seller.
Yeah.
And I never heard of the co-author, so O'Reilly was being very generous, I think, in allowing the other guy to presumably reap some of the rewards of this being a big seller.
Conspiracy in the book?
Well, the other thing is, I've so far produced 17 books. And I know what a hell of a lot of work it is and how much time. And I don't think a virtually daily commentator on a network news program is going to have the time or the energy, even if he's a lot younger than I am, to do this kind of research. I would say this also about Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, which everybody knows was done by one of his buddies, and Al Gore's supposed book. These guys are not authors. There's no way they could produce these books given the amount of time and energy it takes. I just say this on the basis of my own experience. So I'm skeptical, but I did find some contradictions in the O'Reilly book. The first place, on page 5 of the book, it states the car collided with an army truck full of drunken joy-riding soldiers. Nonsense. Because elsewhere in the book, that was on page 5, it says, it doesn't matter. Anyway, they refer to these 3 occupants. But the accident report only refers to 2 occupants. And I don't know, when I rode in 6x in the Kentucky National Guard, it was in the back of the truck, not in the cab. So I don't know if those trucks had bench seats or separated seats, but I'm very skeptical. So that's one thing. And another place.
Sir?
Yes. Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, please, anytime.
Maybe I missed it in the conversation. After General Patton's car was struck, with the other general next door to him, Did General Patton move any of his limbs?
Well,
Because my
yeah.
concern
no,
is,
he was apparently instantly paralyzed because he commented to Gay, I couldn't, move my fingers or something. I think I'm paralyzed.
the point is, when they transferred him to the ambulance, going to Heidelberg Hospital,
Yeah.
there could have been some problems at that point with him being in the vehicle.
Absolutely.
That's my concern.
Absolutely. It could have made it worse. Yeah. And there's in the O'Reilly book, it raises a different question. It says, well, it was half an hour before they moved him, and why weren't there any spinal cord doctors on hand? Well, it's a Sunday morning. All these guys are, they're at church or services, or they're getting ready to go back to the States. And curiously, the surgeon that they did, that the Army did raise up and flew to Germany with Patton's wife, as a matter of fact, he was a neighbor of my great aunts in Louisville, and indeed, I never knew this at the time until I put things together. His son, I went through high school with, knew him very well. I never realized that he was the general, and he was, a well-known spinal surgeon in Louisville, and the Army, they nailed him as the best man to get over to Germany to treat General Patton.
How far was the hospital from the crash site?
Let me see if we can bring up that map again.
Because if he wasn't strapped in there properly, he could have injured his spinal column going to the hospital.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely,
That's
absolutely. Or any movement that he made, after he broke that, he's
going to have some problems.
oh, by the way, that's where he's buried. Now, I just had these just for the fun of it to complete the presentation. There's George C. Scott as Patton, and there's Patton as Patton. all what used to be called fruit salad. Well,
Sir, how long before he died? How long was he in hospital?
well, he died on the 21st of December, and he was injured on the 9th. So, it was, 12 days or so that he lived. But think about this, what we know about the character of this guy, and he'd been in the Olympic team and a cavalryman and all this kind of stuff. What a terrible life he faced, paralyzed from the neck down from this broken spine. Yes, sir.
My wife and I have to be at another appointment at 4 o'clock, but I want to just throw this in. My uncle is referred to in the Patton movie as Dick. He was his chauffeur. He wasn't driving that morning. He had been, in the words of my uncle, sent on a wild goose chase to pick up an officer in a distant place. The officer never showed up. Woodring should not have been in that car. Just something to share with you as to, it wasn't all just like it's been portrayed. So again, I just want to leave you with that because my uncle, till his dying day, did not believe what he read about the accident. With that, my wife and I have to be excused.
Okay, I knew Woody Woodring for 2 years in Birmingham, Michigan, and he has photographs and pictures, and he testifies to what happened.
He was there. He was there. But he wasn't the regular chauffeur.
No, he was the driver for 3 months. His regular driver that he had all during World War II was sent back to the States.
No, he wasn't.
Well, he was no longer his driver.
My uncle was an MP that was there well after he helped clean out a lot of the concentration camps.
Well, you ask about how far, and this is the map, and if I'm reading it correctly, it's 4 or 5 kilometers between the accident site and Heidelberg. Now, we don't know now, of course, what the condition of the roads or bridges or anything like that, or where the hospital was in Heidelberg, but it wasn't all that great distance. And so they might have been traveling very carefully and so on. We don't know about that. That's not something that anybody considered and looked into. And in fact, as you can tell from the tone of the release the news release that I read to you, they thought he was going to recover. Or some people did, at any rate. Or they wouldn't have admitted that he might not. But a spinal injury is a very serious thing, and they're very unpredictable. Yes, ma'am.
Has there been a blood clot in the brain?
That's what.
Well, they didn't do an autopsy.
For a blood clot.
Yeah, a blood clot.
That's
Yeah.
how he actually died.
Yeah. And again, this is one of the things that happens, I guess, in a spinal break. There it not only has paralysis, but it can mess up the whole human system.
When you have internal injuries, doctors have a hard time figuring out what's wrong with you. If you're bleeding inside, they have to figure out.
Oh yeah, and spinal injuries
or any kind of injury you got inside your body.
The spinal injuries are very hard. Spinal injuries are very hard to repair and predict what's going to happen.
Especially back in the days.
There's a similar accident that happened here in Michigan on Woodward Avenue with one of the Red Wing players.
Oh yeah.
And it was in a limousine, one of these.
Extended wheelbase, Jones, yeah.
He was unstrapped in the back, and the limousine hit a tree, and he was propelled forward like Patton and broke his neck and caused a similar injury. Right, for the Russian.
Oh, I imagine, in the universe there are a lot of these kinds of accidents, and we've all known of others. Somebody dives into the shallow end of a swimming pool, for example, and break their neck. They get paralyzed, they die, they get thrown.
He didn't have a divider there, I was thinking, I said, he could have still been flying forward, hit the dashboard, or hit the windshield.
Yeah.
It depends how much of a distance you're in. I don't know.
Yes, sir.
I'm sure about you police or Cadillac in the museum is the actual car, or was it rebuilt?
Well, all I know is that when the Army had it rebuilt, the General Motors again had quite an establishment in France before the war, and as did Ford in particular, and maybe Chrysler less so. And the Army was making use of those for one thing, General Motors supplying all these 6x. They needed repairs and maintenance and so on. So there was quite an established relationship between General Motors and the Army to maintain these vehicles, not the handful of limousines that were not destroyed in the war, but like this would have been captured and then recaptured. And so GM, when they repaired it, they probably just looked in the parts bin and what did they have there? They had a front clip for a 39, and so that's what they put on it. And again, they put another engine in it at that point. It was easier just to swap engines than to try to repair it. So the car now at the museum is not the car it was before the accident.
Well, it is the car, but it has a 39 front end on it.
Yeah.
And that's the difference. What he's saying is if you look at a 38, the headlights are molded right in the fender. And if you look at this 39, the headlight is up near the radiator or the side of the car.
okay.
There,
So that's
right.
why he's saying there's a difference.
There you go.
On the right is a 38, and that headlight is molded right into the fender. In the car that's in Patton Museum, those headlights are up near the grill or up above.
Yeah,
So
they're-
that's why Mike is saying the car's been changed. And what they did, they took a 39 Ford front end out of a junkyard or somewhere around and put it on to repair this car. Instead of just repairing the left fender or the hood, they just put a whole new front end on.
Yes, ma'am.
When you said it didn't have the same engine, what were the differences between the engines?
Probably very little. They were both Cadillac production flathead engines, V8s, indeed, when I was in the Kentucky National Guard, our vehicle also had, it was a tank-like vehicle with a howitzer mounted on it, and it had a Cadillac flathead and a hydromatic transmission, automatic transmission, for each side of the vehicle to drive the right and left-hand treads separately. So the engine, you know, it probably in today's world, you wouldn't be able to transfer them so readily because of the required emission control equipment and God only knows what else, differences. But for a 30, to take a Cadillac flathead out of a tank or wherever, buy it from General Motors and drop it in was not a big deal.
When he was killed, was the war over?
Oh yeah. The war in Europe was concluded when the Germans surrendered. I think it was May 7th. So, and this was what, 7 months later or 8 months later.
War in
Yeah.
the Pacific.
Oh, I thought it was still, I didn't know it was still,
No,
I thought it was going on.
no. It ended when the Germans finally surrendered with the Russians invading or taking over Berlin and all that kind of stuff, and Hitler committed suicide in the bunker and all of that. But at that point, we still had the war going on in the Pacific until we dropped
The
the.
war was over when he was killed.
Yes, it had been Japan, and the troops that weren't being sent home were being prepared to ship to invade Japan.
There weren't enough boats to take us all home at once.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, you were talking about the car could have been a German one, or it could have been owned by the...
Well, no, I'm sort of joking that it's a stolen car because the Germans stole it from whoever bought it in the first place before the war, and then the U.S. Army took it away from the Germans, and I don't think they ever gave a receipt or anything like that. I think the receipt probably, I can imagine, when the American Army captured that thing, they probably said, you know, be thankful we didn't kill you, that kind of thing. And the Germans probably did the same thing to whoever owned
During
it.
World War I, they took some of the American troops home on German captured ships.
Oh yeah, oh
I
yeah.
didn't even know that until my uncle from World War I told me that. He goes, yeah, we captured ships, and then they changed the name, and then they put troops on it.
Well, and in fact, there was so much anti-German stuff in my hometown, which had a sizable German population, because it was a Rhine-like city on the Ohio. They changed the names of the leading bank, which was the German bank or the Deutsche Bank or something like that. They had to change it to the Liberty Bank, and some of the main streets which had German names, they had to change them to American names and so on. So there was a lot of that going on.
Thank you for the presentation.
Well, I'm sorry if it ran on as long as I did. I'm an old Kentucky storyteller, and I tend to ramble on, and got so many things tucked away up here. You've been very patient. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. We'll have some books up here for sale, and if any of you want some tickets for the quilt, let me know. Otherwise, we'll try to be pulling it. And hopefully we'll see you all next Sunday. Phil Todd will be talking about the 106th Infantry Division in World War II.